Sir, I have great news. We've finally beaten back the cyborgs. Great work, soldier. Let's make sure we keep those cyborgs under lock and key from now on. But sir, don't you think keeping the cyborgs subjugated will lead to further resentment and plotting against the Super Earth government? Subja, what did you just say? I don't understand a lot of the words you just said to me, son. You better follow my orders. Okay, sir. Subjugating the cyborgs. I don't think this will have any possible future repercussions. 100 years later. Ah, crap. The kid was right. The consequences of my action have come to haunt me. Have you ever wondered where the Automatons in Helldivers 2 come from? They certainly share a lot of similarities with the Cyborgs from Helldivers 1, but how exactly did we get from the Cyborgs of Helldivers 1 to the Automatons of Helldivers 2? And that is exactly what we're going to explore today. I'm going to take a look at how some of the enemies from Helldivers 1 have morphed and evolved to become the Automatons we see today, and what happened to some of the Helldivers 1 enemies that we don't see anymore in the game. For this breakdown, let's start out with the super basic dude from Helldivers 1, the Initiate. The Initiate here was the super basic, easy to defeat enemy from Helldivers 1. They were meant to come at you en masse and just try to overwhelm you. They were very easy to take down because they had very little armor, and they were lightly armed with just one gun and one knife that someone duct taped to their hand. Now, you may be thinking this looks like just a regular dude and not really robotic at all. Like, duct taping a knife to someone's hand is not really a cyborg. And you'd be right, because it was very common for the cyborgs to capture and indoctrinate Super Earth citizens and turn them into these really basic fighting machine initiates. The cyborgs didn't need high fighting skill of these initiates. They just needed mass to soak up bullets from Super Earth. And man, that sure sounds a lot like the Trooper from Helldivers 2. The Trooper here is functionally the same. It's just a dude walking around with a gun, and instead of a knife duct taped to his arm, he's just got a metal fist that hurts just as much. And the Automatons use these Troopers in the exact same way as the Initiates. They just have them come at you en masse and hope to overwhelm you, while some of them get taken out, and that's okay. Now, you may be thinking, hold on there, Nate. The Troopers in Helldivers 2 have all sorts of variants. You're telling me there's just one Initiate? Oh, no, don't worry. The Initiate had variants in Helldivers 1, too. And those variants are as follows. You had the Immolator, the Comrade, the Berserker, the Butcher, the Hound, and the Grotesque. But before we talk about these variants, I think it's important that we talk about how the Initiate became the Trooper. And that's going to get into how the Cyborgs transitioned into the Automatons. Now, I've previously done a video on the lore of the Automatons and how they are today, but I haven't covered as much how the Cyborgs became the Automatons. Now, what we know from the history books of Super Earth, which should probably be taken with a grain of salt, is that after the events of Helldivers 1, the Cyborgs were beaten back to Cyberstan and forced back into work there. And the Cyborgs, after seeing how well their first revolution went, getting their butts kicked and put back on Cyberstan, they realized, we gotta do something else if we're gonna try to break free from Super Earth here. As we go through the bigger and more elite enemies from Helldivers 1 here, you'll see that the Cyborgs had a culture of the more elite and the more special people were more robotic. And this is kind of along the lines of how the Adeptus Mechanicus are in Warhammer, actually. The ideal way to be is to be almost entirely mechanical. So I suspect that while the Cyborgs were subjugated to working on Cyberstan, they started to tinker. They started to find ways to become truly fully mechanical, other than their brains. And this is something they could likely petition to their Super Earth governors on the planet that, oh, well, if we make this guy fully robotic, he doesn't need to eat, he doesn't need to sleep, he can just keep working. This is going to be perfect for increasing productivity. And said governors would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. More money for Super Earth, perfect. And those Super Earth governors were completely overlooking that the Cyborgs were building an even more efficient fighting machine. And that is how we got from the Initiates of Helldivers 1 up to the Trooper. They worked and tinkered until they finally perfected the way to just stick a human brain into a robotic body and make it work. Which leads to some of the scenes we see around the battlefield now. All sorts of, chopped up people bits because the Automatons are trying to harvest brains in order to put into new bodies and make these really basic soldiers. These captured brains obviously aren't thinking, man, I love the Automatons, I want to help them out. So they need to keep them as the basic soldiers in order to just make them do simple tasks like walk forward, shoot. They can't have them do more complicated tasks that would require more thinking. Hey, thanks for hitting that subscribe button so much last time. We were able to buy Garfield a big rig. Ooh, you didn't hit that subscribe button last time? That's making Garfield pretty sad back there. You better hit it this time. All right, back to the video. Now, with that covered on how the first Automatons came to be, allegedly, per my, very extensive research, let's talk about these variants of the Initiate. Our first variant of the Initiate that we have here doesn't exactly have a comparison in Helldivers 2. It is the Immolator, and this here was just a dude with a flamethrower. Now, there is an enemy in Helldivers 2 that has a flamethrower, and that is the Hulk, but I can't say it's a direct comparison because that's a massive walking armored box, and this is just a dude. And also, to jump ahead a little bit, there was a Hulk in Helldivers 1 as well. So this here, they didn't seem to keep the flamethrower on the basic guys yet. I suspect sometime in the future, the Automatons may start rolling out these flamethrower basic dudes because, hey, fire's good. But as it stands right now, we don't have a counterpart in Helldivers 2 for the Immolator here. And interestingly enough, these Immolators were never really just walking around the planet on patrols for you to take out. They were only called in by squad leader soldiers who saw maybe a large enough group of Helldivers that they thought, man, we need some fire to deal with this. Which leads well into the next enemy we want to talk about here, the squad leader soldier themselves. The squad leader, well, had a giant cannon on its arm that could shoot grenades at you, as well as shoot up the alarm flares to call in more cyborgs. And this is where we see an interesting discrepancy between the cyborgs and the automatons. In Helldivers 1, only these squad leaders could call in reinforcements, not the basic initiates or anything. Whereas in Helldivers 2, any basic trooper can call in reinforcements. The cyborgs in Helldivers 1 were still fairly human, and they only really trusted the leaders to be calling in these reinforcements properly. Whereas in Helldivers 2, it seems that they've perfected programming just the basic troopers to raise the alarm whenever they see anything, and then to appropriately call in the amount of force they need to deal with the problem. Now, just because all the basic troopers can call in reinforcements doesn't mean that the squad leader cyborg from Helldivers 1 does not have a counterpart in Helldivers 2. We have the Commissar in the Automaton army. And the Commissar acts almost exactly like the squad leader. Their main goal is to immediately when they see an enemy, call in reinforcements. Now, the Commissar is a little bit different than the squad leader as they are not as heavily armed. Instead of the big grenade launcher, the Commissar here only gets a little pistol, so they're not as much of a threat themselves, but the fact that they call in reinforcements immediately is a huge threat. You need to take these out very quickly. And since I don't really have a good segue to move on to the next enemy, let's talk about the Comrade that was in Helldivers 1. The Comrade was more or less a beefed up initiate. Instead of getting a little gun, they got a giant cannon on their arm. Instead of having a little knife taped to their arm, they had their entire arm replaced with a giant sword. Now, the ranks of the Automatons in Helldivers 2 don't exactly have a comparison to this guy here, but I think that's because when the Cyborgs were building the Automatons, they decided to specialize more. This guy here kind of didn't make sense. He's got a big cannon, which leads to believe he should be further back, but he's also got a big sword, which makes you think he should be running in for close combat. So I think they decided to split this guy up into essentially the Rocket Trooper and the Raider that runs at you with two swords. This specialization into two separate enemy types here made them more efficient. Like, it doesn't make sense to be long range and close combat. Like, either way, you're not using one of your arms properly. Whereas the Rocket Trooper can stay in the back and just launch rockets at things, and the Raider can just fly in and go stabbing. This shows that the Cyborgs were putting aside their urge to make themselves individually the best they can be and the most mechanical, and instead making the most efficient fighting machines they could. Which, speaking of close combat, let's move on to our next cyborg that always was meant for close combat, the Berserker, which you'll notice shares a name with an automaton, the Berserker. The Berserker here remains basically unchanged throughout the two games, other than the Berserker in Helldivers 1 being, having a normal torso in the middle that's a little horrifying, and now the Berserker in Helldivers 2 being fully mechanical. Both of them would just run at you with melee weapons and just try to hack you to pieces. And they both, too, quite terrifyingly might I note, could take quite a beating, and they could eat up some good damage before they go down, making them a very dangerous foe to fight in both games. Now, our next Helldivers 1 enemy, the Butcher here, is a very interesting one, not only because of its comparisons to the Automatons, but because of the lore itself in Helldivers 1. The Butcher was the one that actually did all the modifying and augmenting of all the rest of the Cyborgs. This is the guy that was slapping on metal arms. This is, if you watched my previous video, Dave the Leg Wizard. And this guy was a beast to take down, because he's just a big chunk of flesh, quite terrifyingly, which it's not all metal going on there. This guy's just scary to look at, which also means that the Butcher was probably working in some biological modification and not just metal modification, because there's no way this guy got that big just, by hanging out. Now, while this Butcher here doesn't exactly have a counterpart in Helldivers 2, because, they don't need to do modification anymore, everything's made in a factory, I think the Devastator is a pretty close one as far as how they fight on the battlefield here. The Devastator is big, chunky, has a lot of armor, is tough to take down. And the standard one is pretty similar, where it's just got a basic gun and a fist to punch it with. Now, the Butcher didn't have any guns, and he had just both melee weapons, but I think, you know, as they were building up the automatons, they're like, it's probably a good idea we give this thing some sort of ranged weapon. Even if it's not the main focus, it better have something. Now, I mentioned that the Butcher obviously was working with some, you know, biological modification as well as mechanical modification to the cyborgs here, because he's covered in all sorts of weird fleshy bits. Which leads well into a Helldivers 1 enemy that does not have a counterpart and probably never will, the Grotesque. And these guys are, well, what's the word I'm looking for here? What are they to look at there? Oh, they're grotesque to look at because they're horrifying flesh abominations that, as lore says, are fallen initiates that were too wounded to heal up normally, so they just melded them into these weird creatures that would just run at the enemy and know nothing else other than slap with my claws. Now, since the automatons have gone basically fully mechanical, I doubt we'll be seeing creatures like this in Helldivers 2. These things are a relic of the past, and the automatons are not dealing with them. And moving on to an enemy that also doesn't have a counterpart in Helldivers 2, but I think may get one eventually, is the Hound, which is more or less a robotically enhanced doggo. Which, if you played Helldivers 1, you remember these guys, because they were a pain to deal with. They didn't take much damage to take out, but if you weren't paying attention, they were incredibly fast, and they would run at you and just knock you down and take you out almost immediately. Now, of course, in their war against Super Earth, the cyborgs just had to go and turn dogs into violent machines of death. But why don't we see that in the automatons? The automatons don't just readily have pets laying around. They don't need pets. They don't take care of pets. They're fully robotic. And that means there just wasn't any around to turn into automatons, so they didn't bother. But it would be interesting to see if they decided to add back in an enemy like this for the automatons, because right now, a lot of the automatons are pretty slow. Making one that was really fast and would run at you on all fours and was like a truly robotic dog would be very interesting to fight. Now, that covers all the basic infantry from the cyborgs, but that doesn't quite cover all the basic infantry from the automatons. Most of them had counterparts, like the Brawler and the Rocket Raider were a split of the Comrade and whatnot, but there's one here we didn't really talk about, the Assault Trooper, because the Assault Trooper gets a jetpack. Now, I think the cyborgs developed this Assault Trooper with a jetpack because they were phasing out the Hounds. They didn't want to deal with dogs anymore. They're just going to make a normal guy and slap a jetpack on him so we can go flying at the enemy and get real close. Because not only can this thing get up real close for melee real quick, like the Hound could, they gave this guy a gun, so he can shoot you when he's really close too. And there's one more interesting enemy that you could kind of call it a trooper in the Automatons army, the Scout Strider, because this is just a trooper that's standing on a walker that's got a gun on it. And I'm sure the cyborgs saw the walkers that the Helldivers used in Helldivers 1 and decided, hey, we want something like that for ourselves. So they built a very simple one because they couldn't get the really complex machines the Helldivers are building, and they just put 2 legs and a gun on it and made it a lot simpler. But worry not, or maybe more accurately, worry a ton, because these things probably live in your nightmares like they do mine, because the Automatons did eventually build the Hulk, which looks a whole lot like the Helldivers walkers. But there was a Hulk in the Cyborgs army as well. And it almost reminds me more of the shield devastators that we have in the Automatons now, because this was just a big dude carried a shield and a minigun. But what's the reasoning for this little name switcheroo? Why is the Hulk from the Cyborgs much more similar to the shield devastators that we have now? That's actually because in the Cyborg army, there was an even stronger enemy that honestly looks more like our modern day Hulks in the Automatons army, the Warlord. Just taking a look at this Warlord here, you can see the resemblance to the Automatons Hulks. It's fully armored. It only has one real weak point, its head right there. It's got a heavy cannon. It's got a big arm. This thing was a monster to deal with, which sounds a whole lot like our modern day Hulks, which are heavily armored, a pain to deal with, and they only really have one good weak point. But again, what's the reason for this name switching? Why is the Warlord we're looking at here much similar to the Automatons Hulk? And then why is the Hulk from the Cyborgs much similar to the Devastator? I think that's because as the Cyborgs were building these automatons, they wanted to improve. They wanted to leave room for improvement. So they're saving this Warlord class of enemy for something even more devastating than the Hulk that we see today. Now, you could argue this even tougher class of enemy they were saving the name Warlord for is actually the Factory Strider we see today, because it's large, it's heavily armored, and it's got some good firepower on it. But as Helldivers, we see it and go, wow, that thing creates other bots. That's a Factory Strider. And maybe the Cyborgs meant that to be a Warlord. But let's talk about that Factory Strider for a moment here while we're on the topic. Why would the Cyborgs design something like this? Well, currently, as you notice very well in the game, the stationary factories, very easy to blow up, very easy to take down. a heavily armored walking factory, much harder to take out, and it can fight back. And they were probably thinking, we need to design something that can take the fight to the enemies, the Helldivers, of course. And this is the best way to do it, because if we need reinforcements, we can make them right there. But let's take a moment to talk about heavy vehicles, because I'm sure you're all familiar with the Automatons tank. It's heavily armored, it's a pain to deal with, it's a big boy. But the Cyborgs had something similar. They had the infantry fighting vehicle, which, well, it does look like the tank, is not a tank, because as the name implies, this thing carried infantry. It would just dump grotesques out the back of it to come fight you. Now, why is it the Cyborgs have moved towards a fully dedicated tank rather than this infantry fighting vehicle that could drop off infantry? Well, that's because the Automatons managed to develop the dropship, which can drop off infantry. So they no longer need this land vehicle to bring reinforcements because they've got an air vehicle that can drop off robots right on top of your noggin. There's no reason to bother taking up space in their tanks with infantry when they can just drop them off in the air. They might as well just put more firepower on this thing. So they've moved to just fully fledged tanks. So with that, we've covered pretty much every cyborg that has a counterpart in Helldivers 2 and does not. Except for the big one, the monster, the raid boss, the huge boy. It was the siege mech. The Cyborgs had a siege mech that was absolutely covered in guns, super heavily armored, and was literally a raid boss for you to fight. This thing got a health bar. I don't think you could argue that Factory Striders took the place of these siege mechs, because Factory Striders have one gun on them. The siege mechs were loaded with weapons to take down Helldivers. The Factory Striders clearly to make things, the siege mech is meant to destroy things. But why don't the Automatons have a massive enemy like this? It'd be very good against the Helldivers. I think it's for a very similar reason that the Terminids do not have their Hive Lord, which you haven't seen my video on how the Helldivers 1 bugs became the Helldivers 2 Terminids. You should totally go check it out after watching this one. But they don't have it because of actual development reasons and not lore reasons yet. I suspect that eventually Arrowhead Studios is going to add these really specific missions for raid bosses, where the only point of the mission is to fight this giant enemy. It's going to be an extreme difficulty. It's going to be incredibly hard to do. You're going to have to fight it in multiple places around the map, take out a third of its health, fight through some bots to get to its next location, take out another third. But it hasn't been added yet because they're still working on them. So with that, and until Arrowhead releases more lore and new enemies, that's about all the comparisons we can make between the Cyborgs and the current Automatons we have. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you find it interesting, fun, funny, whatever, I'd love if you hit that like button down below and consider subscribing to my channel. It really supports me and helps me make more of these videos. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.